Hey, good morning, good afternoon. I'm back again. So this reading was kind of dense. You're reading pages 90 through 97. We're talking about federalism and how it actually works. So there are the focus questions you guys are looking at already, and let's go ahead and get into the actual slides themselves. There were a bunch. I hated them all, so I actually redid a bunch to make it a lot easier to understand. So let's first talk about why the founders chose federalism. Now, we talked about it in the previous video that under the English, when we were colonies, we practiced the unitary system where the national government was all powerful. Didn't work out very well for the colonists. That's why they had the whole revolution and taxation without representation. Then we tried the confederal system where it was under the Articles of Confederation. That didn't work out. The national government wasn't strong enough to actually do anything important. So they had to come up with a balance between the two, and that's where they created the federal system. So the other reason they created the federal system was really to limit power. By creating two co-equal branches, they would kind of fight, and they would cancel each other out, really leaving people, you and I, with the greatest degree of freedom possible. Even though we are operating under two different governments, those governments would often counteract each other or cross each other and leave you and I free to be as free as we possibly could be. And the other reason they did it was they wanted to give people access to government. They really wanted to embrace the ideals of democratic representative government so that people would have the opportunity to be involved in government, maybe not making all the significant decisions, but making decisions along the way. So that was one of the other reasons they chose to go with the federal system versus the confederal or unitary, because it gave people more access to government. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next slide. And this is the one I created because I didn't like the way everything else is done. It was like page after page of slides, and I thought, let's just make this easy. So here's federalism, and we have I'm going to do two spheres. It's a classical Venn diagram. We have our national powers in green here. We have our state powers in red, and then in purple we've got our concurrent powers, which you guys are reading about. So let's go ahead and look at our national powers. So these are national powers, also known as enumerated or expressed. So you will see all three of these terms used interchangeably to describe the same thing. So you need to be familiar with all three of these terms. I think you have a note card for enumerated powers. You probably should add notes on there. They're also called expressed powers or national powers. And again, they will be used interchangeably. I cannot guarantee you that they're going to use just one of these on the AP test. They might use expressed powers. So you have to understand what that is and that there's a difference. Okay? Well, actually, they're all the same, but that they'll use them interchangeably. That happens all the time on the AP test. So, declare war, national power, create and maintain an army and a navy, treaties with foreign countries, regulating interstate trade, trade between states, and foreign commerce. Okay, copyright and patent laws. And that's important because this is intellectual property, and they wanted to protect that too. They wanted to protect your right to own your ideas and your inventions and give you exclusive rights to those so you can profit off of that. Because remember, we're talking early American history here. We believe in capitalism. We still do believe in capitalism. And if you have an idea, it should be your idea and you should make money off of that idea and not somebody else. So they created stuff so you can protect your intellectual property. Okay, establish post offices. Seems pretty straightforward. That way you can help facilitate interstate communication, coin money, so it's a big national thing, so there's only one currency instead of 13 currencies. It's easier for everybody to understand, just like in Europe nowadays. Everyone uses the euro instead of the German franc the French franc and the German Deutschmark and the Italian lira. You would have to do exchange rates traveling between all those countries. Now they have one currency. It's easier for everyone to exchange money because it's the same single type of currency. And that's kind of what the framers of the Constitution wanted to do, was make sure that trade between the 13 colonies or the 13 states was easy, so there's just one currency, not 13. Okay, national power also, naturalization laws. So who gets to become a citizen, how that happens, they do the whole process. Okay, and admitting new states. That's another big, important national power, that the national government is the one who decides who becomes a new state, as long as people follow the rules. And there are some rules on becoming a state. All right, concurrent powers. Powers we share in both spheres. Okay, it's going to be the power to tax. National taxes, state taxes, even local taxes, and I think I talked about that in the previous slide, that, we get taxed a whole bunch as Americans. Okay, establishing courts. There are national courts and then there are state courts. Very rarely will you ever have to deal with a national court. Most of the time you and I will deal with state courts and even local courts. If we're going for a traffic violation, that's a state court, not a national court. Most of the crimes that people commit nowadays, so if you ever get called for jury duty, they're state courts, not national courts. So you and I very rarely will ever have to deal with a national court. But they are in both spheres. Okay, borrow money. That's important because sometimes we need to spend more than we're taking in. Right now we do that every year as a country. As a state, we have to have a balanced budget, so we can only spend as much as we take in. At the national level, we spend more than we actually take in taxes. So we'll get to that a little later when we talk about fiscal policy, but basically, right now, I think last year's budget, we spent $3.5 trillion, but we only took in like 1.8 trillion. So, we're spending way more than we're taking in. It's adding to our national debt very quickly. But both can do that because sometimes we need to spend money in order to make the country run efficiently. Okay, both have the power to charter banks. At the national level, we're going to learn about this in a court case called McCulloch versus Maryland, where we have a national bank. And on the state level, you have state banks. That's why oftentimes you'll see banks only in one place. For instance, Bank of America used to be only a California bank, and then it went national and became big. A lot of times you might have like local credit unions, which are very much localized. So, and those are regulated by states, not the national government, but the national government can do the same with big national banks. And the national bank really is the Federal Reserve Board, and they're the ones who control the flow of money in our economic system, which again we'll talk about in more detail later on. Okay, make and implement policy. Basically, this is taking ideas and turning them into laws. Okay, and these are free-flowing and constant, and they're ever-evolving. New laws are always coming up, and old laws are being disregarded or being completely overturned later on. But implementing and making policy is basically just taking the ideas of the will of the public and turning them into laws. So if we vote in a Republican president like President Trump, we are saying that we would like to see more conservative laws happen in this country. And when he makes those laws, that's basically what we're saying is thank you for making those laws. That's what we talked about when we were during the election. So, yeah, making and implementing policy, both sides get to do that. And last but not least, that is a shared power, something called eminent domain. And eminent domain is really the government's ability to take your property. It's tied in with the Fifth Amendment, which is also dealing with like search and seizure. So the government just can't take your stuff. They have to have good reasons for it. They actually have to have a warrant or justifiable cause. And if they want to permanently take it, they have to use what's called the eminent domain clause. And they have to go through a legal process to actually take the property away. So I think the biggest areas where this happens, especially that you and I would be involved in, would be like in our city where they need to build a new high school. High schools are really big things and they often take up a lot of property. And if we're looking at like a really busy, impacted residential area, there's not a lot of property that they can pick from. So they have to use eminent domain and say, all right, we're going to take this piece of property. Yes, you own part of it. We're going to give you fair market value. We're just not going to take it and say, screw you. We're going to take it and pay you the fair market value of that property. And then we're going to use it to build a high school. So that's one of the reasons why they have the eminent domain clause, because sometimes they need to do it for public good. I know for you guys, you've grown up your whole lives with the 210 freeway in Fontana, not a big deal. I remember when I wasn't there, and people used to live in that area, and the state of California and the federal government had to come in and say, hey, we're going to take your property to build a big freeway so that it's easier for Californians in the Southern California area to move about. So they took their property and they gave them fair market value for it. So they paid them what it was worth. Maybe at a sentimental value, but they can't compensate for that, but they can compensate you for the actual cost of it. Alright, that's a long explanation of what eminent domain is. I'll probably come back to it again later on when we're talking about civil liberties and civil rights, because there's a couple of important cases when it comes to taking your property. Next we have state powers. Okay, state powers are important. We have conducting elections, redistricting U.S. House districts. We're going to talk about that in a lot more detail in the next unit, in Unit 2, because we're going to be talking about the House of Representatives and a lot of what goes into that. So we'll come back to this one a little bit more. and I forgot to list conducting elections. This is really important. This is why states were able to disenfranchise black voters a long time ago. So the national government said, hey, 13th Amendment, slaves are now free. 14th Amendment, anybody born in the U.S. is now an automatic citizen, granting citizenship to all the slaves. The 15th Amendment was saying that any man, and technically it was a man at that point, had the right to vote regardless of race. But southern states were able to exclude black voters because conducting elections is actually the state's responsibility. It's not the national government's. All elections happen at the local level, which means for you and I, when we vote here in San Bernardino County, it's the San Bernardino County Registrar that runs the election. Not the state of California, but our county. And they're the ones who also make sure that you have access to vote. There are certain rules, and most every state follows the same set of rules. You have to be a citizen of the U.S. to vote, which is legal. You have to be a resident of the state in which you're currently voting, yes. And you have to be over 18. Those are the only qualifications now that they have to make sure you fit into. Now, there are some other ones about residency. Some states have an issue where if you just move to the state, you can't vote right away. You have to wait 30 days because they want to make sure you establish residency. Also, they're making sure you don't cross state lines and vote in the other state to offset their election, so they have little time limits, but they have to eventually let you out after that 30-day window of you moving into the state. And we're going to get into that when we come to the Privileges and Immunities Clause in just a few minutes. All right, state power also ratifying constitutional amendments. Remember, Congress proposes, states ratify. Okay, building infrastructure, roads, highways, ports, bridges, technically railroads and airports one day, but those don't exist just yet when we're talking about this, but eventually, yes. Okay, administer family laws. And this is important. This is like divorces and marriages and all that stuff. Okay. Provide education. It's a state's responsibility. I get paid by the state of California. I do not get paid by the national government. Let me take a step back. I don't even get paid by the state of California. I get paid by the San Bernardino County. My check says San Bernardino County on it. My teacher license over here with Regulating Professions is through the state of California, but then I'm employed by the school district of Fontana. So it's kind of complicated, but to say all that happens at the local level. So my paycheck, my teaching license, all happen at the state level, not the national level. Okay. And then states can also regulate health and safety, and they can regulate professions. Okay, so these are all the things that states do. They're also known as reserved powers and police powers. So again, 3 interchangeable terms: state powers, reserved powers, police powers. Just know that they will use any of those 3, not just one of them specifically every single time. Now, the reason the framers did this was that because they wanted most of our lives to be affected by the state. Okay, a little bit by the national, and the national stuff is really big foreign policy stuff. That's what the national government's there to do, is to deal with other countries. Most of your daily life will be here, and even with these concurrent powers. Very rarely is your life going to be dealing with this over here. The only time I deal with the federal government is when I pay my taxes with the IRS and when I have to get a passport and leave the country. Other than that, most of what happens in my normal life happens on this side over here. So, just a little bit about that. So just know these are interchangeable terms at the top. Okay, you can look at the slide later on. Let's go to the next one. Let's talk about enumerated powers, because it talks about it in your book. So what is an enumerated power? Okay, to levy and collect taxes. Now, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and you can read this here. This is what it actually says about Congress doing taxes. This is an enumerated power. It is clearly stated in the Constitution. This is literally what it says. Okay. Now, you add the power to collect taxes. You had the elastic clause, which again, in the Constitution, Article 1, last section we looked at, Clause 18, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry into execution the foregoing powers, which means the powers above, and all other powers that are in the Constitution, in the government of the United States, or any department or officer thereof. Okay, that's the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. So you do that, and we get things like this: create the IRS, punish tax evasion, regulate the licensing of certain items, ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Those all need special tax stamps in order to be sold. That's why, like, if you watch one of those, I think History Channel or Discovery has like moonshiners. Okay, they're making alcohol, but they're not getting a tax stamp, so it's illegal. If you make it and you get a tax stamp, it's totally legal. Okay, So the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. This is also how the national government regulates the sale of marijuana. It's technically legal. All you need is a tax stamp to sell marijuana in the U.S. The government no longer issues the tax stamps. So in effect, they have made the sale of marijuana illegal because you cannot get a tax stamp anymore from the national government. But they still can issue them. So this is part of the debate we have today when we're talking about federalism in California and other states legalizing marijuana. We're basically telling the national government, hey, we're exercising, if we go back to that last slide, health, safety, police powers. This is our belonging, not the national government's. You shouldn't be regulating that. So now there's kind of a debate nationally, like who's right? States that are exercising their state powers to do something like that, or the national government? And again, there is debate on this. And it all depends upon your perspective of the powers of the national government. But I'm going to come back to this right now. So creating an IRS, punish tax evasion. If we go back to that image that was up here, it didn't say anything about creating any of those things or doing any of that stuff. It just said the power to lay and collect taxes. So what does this mean? This is implied power, okay? That you can have these powers. So you have the enumerated, the express power that's from the Constitution. It's clearly stated. You have the elastic clause, kind of like a catalyst, and then you get more out of it. So these are the implied powers. This is the enumerated power up here. We'll give you one more example. Regulate commerce. Okay, add the elastic clause. Okay, now all of a sudden the national government can set a minimum wage. They can outlaw workplace discrimination. They can institute Obamacare, regulate banking. They can have the Americans with Disability Act because it's regulating commerce between the 50 states. So this is making it equal. So this is why we have a national minimum wage. States can go above that, but the national one is the base for every state. This is why they can't discriminate against you at the workplace, and if they do, they're violating the law. Obamacare was because some states, it's easier to get insurance than other states, so that's not fair, so they were trying to settle that out. And then regulating banking, Americans with Disabilities Act, all those are implied powers, because it literally in the Constitution says that Congress has the power to regulate commerce between states, interstate commerce, foreign nations, and Indian tribes. That's all it says, but we do all this stuff based on that. So that's the implied power from the enumerated power. I hope that makes sense. All right. So we talked about these because it was challenged very early on. There was a situation where the national government created national banks, and the state of Maryland said, hey, that bank is in our state, we're going to tax it. We're going to put a tax on that bank. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know what? No, the national government created that bank. We're using the enumerated powers because this is we have the ability to regulate commerce and the ability to lay and collect taxes. That we're going to create a national bank. And the Supreme Court said the national government's right. Okay, they're correct. Then we also have, Gibbons versus Ogden, where there was a challenge to the Commerce Clause. And this brings us to the Supremacy Clause. So all these cases, Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland, and Gibbons versus Ogden, and this is one of your key terms, Supremacy Clause, give legitimacy to the Supremacy Clause. It's in the Constitution. It says there that the national government is supreme, that if there's a dispute between states or between the state and the national government, ultimately the national government is the right one. For the most part, occasionally the Supreme Court will say, you know what, no. National government, that belongs to the people or the states. That's 10th or 9th Amendment issue areas. That belongs back in the state level. National government step aside. And it happens occasionally. Most of the time it's gone the other way where the national government has gained power. And so that Venn diagram I showed you, we're going to come back and talk about it more and more because we're really going to get into it and we're going to look at the intricacies of federalism and how it's evolved over the last 200 years. All right, so basically, with these three Supreme Court cases, the Supreme Court justices gave legitimacy to the idea of the Supremacy Clause. The national government is supreme. All right, let's go ahead and get over that, and we have a couple more things to cover. I know it's a really long video. I'm sorry. We have national obligations to states. The national government basically has to ensure that states do these things right here. It's pretty straightforward that they have to treat states equally. They can't favor one state over another. They cannot break apart a state. Only a state can break apart a state. So if California decided we wanted to be two different states, it would have to be us doing it, not the national government. So we'd vote internally to become two states, and then we'd have to petition Congress, and Congress might say, no, sorry, not a good idea. We're going to keep you one state. Or they might say, okay, you guys want to do it, we're going to break you into two states. Okay. They can't change state boundaries. Again, this kind of goes to that whole idea of that those two circles, and states, what we designate as our area belongs to us. Okay, what else? Every state has to have a Republican form of government, which means we have to have representative democracy in every state. And then the national government protects us from foreign invasion. And if there's enough problems within the state, the national government, at our request, at the state's request, can send in help. Okay. Let's see. State-to-state obligations. And this is the last slide. I'll be done here. So states have to honor each other. So one of them is extradition. So if you commit a crime in California, flee to Nevada, Nevada has to send you back to California. Okay, that's called extradition. And as long as all the paperwork's in order, it's not a problem, and states do it all the time, routinely. So you can't just leave California to get away. If you get to Nevada, they arrest you, they'll send you back. Okay, this is privileges and immunities that I was talking about earlier. A lot of this has to deal with if you move from California to a different state. Sometimes they have requirements, like you have to register that you moved to the state within the last, 5 days. So once you get there, you have to immediately register that you are a resident of that state. And that states can't treat you unfairly. So if you go from one state to the next, you have to be treated the same as you would if you were a resident of that state. The only exception, and the biggest one that really affects you guys coming up soon, is your in-state tuition. A lot of you are going to stay in California and you'll pay in-state tuition. That's because part of your parents' taxes they've been paying for years have been paid into the California education system, and that includes elementary, high school, and college. So your parents have been paying for the Cal States and UCs and even the community colleges by paying their normal taxes. And so the Supreme Court said, you know what, that's fair. If you're a resident of California, you've been paying into that intentionally as part of your taxes, you should get a benefit from that. So you get in-state tuition. Okay, that's why people who come from out of state pay like triple what you guys are going to pay to go to that same school, which is crazy and expensive, but they do it anyway. But the same happens if you decide to go to Arizona State, you're going to pay a much higher fee than people who live in Arizona because they've been paying taxes there and you haven't. Unless you decide to move there permanently, and then after I think a year or two, you'll get the in-state tuition once you become a permanent resident of Arizona. Okay. And then lastly, full faith and credit clause. This is really important. This is marriage licenses, death certificates, birth certificates, all these things. States have to honor them no matter what. So if you're born in California, you're automatically a resident of California and you're a resident of the United States. And every other state has to recognize that no matter what, that you are a U.S. citizen. That's your birth certificate, marriage certificates. This is really important, especially in the last 10 years. Some states legalized same-sex marriage, so couples are going to Hawaii to get married. Now they can move back to their home state or just return back to their home state, and that state has to honor their marriage license, even though they might have a ban in that state against same-sex marriage. All that gets taken care of a couple of years ago with the court case of Obergefell versus Hodges, which is a court case you're going to have to know, but in Unit 5. So we'll come back to that one again later on, but full faith and credit, states have to honor each other's legal documents. So once you get married in one state, you're married in all 50 states. Doesn't matter. You can't flee to, Nevada, and you're not married to your wife or husband anymore. Once you're married, you're married. And this also comes back to full faith and credit where, courts have to honor each other's decisions. So if your marriage gets, dissolved in California and they force you to pay child support or spousal support and you flee to Nevada, Nevada's courts will say, no, we're going to honor California's wish. And you still have to pay child support and spousal support. And they can force you to do that. All right, sorry, it's a really long video, but there's a lot of information in here. And